Hello, my name is Fraser Simons. This is my channel, Springboard Thought. Today I'm going to be talking about a nonfiction book, Investigative Aesthetics, Conflicts and Commons in the Politics of Truth by Matthew Fuller and Eyal Weizman. Here's the cover. This is a fairly coached in academic or just more sophisticated diction, but it does seem aimed at an academic sort of audience, which is a little bit strange given the subject matter and sort of what they want to accomplish with the text. The purpose of this book essentially is to redefine two common terms in everyday usage in order to make them more pertinent and increase the specificity in which we use them. Both in terms of what they're going to be exploring investigation-wise, but also just the fact that we have a complex relationship with both these terms and are, especially in a political arena, we use these terms very differently, and so we need to update them. Their arguments are quite compelling. They situate aesthetics in a way that is pertaining to art, and because anti-intellectualism and Western culture in generally looks at art as diminutive or something to co-opt or put into the mainstream and then sort of get rid of if it is provoking a reaction in the general intellect, basically. And so aesthetics has always had sort of a diminutive, almost pejorative usage in our everyday terminology, basically. When talking about art, like fashion, like paintings, any kind of visual medium, we're usually describing an aesthetic. Sometimes with books too, we can do that. But they want to further hone in on aesthetics and sort of reclaim the notion of aesthetics away from the common political usage in order to define it as something a little bit more intricate and as pertaining to identity. They approach it as a OSINT, open source investigators sieve through the material that is publicly available and mostly found online. Videos, photos posted by witnesses or perpetrators of violence, commercial satellite images, online databases of scientific data and publications. They look for traces of policies that are invisible, secret, or denied, and work to produce facts that contest statements and other authorities. So they haven't set it up yet in the book. This is quite early on, but the investigation aspect is to form a counter narrative to what is being propagated on the internet. And this can come from official sources. It can come in the form of being bombarded with specific aesthetics, which we'll talk about in a bit. Or it can be just a counter narrative in the fact that the government issues a particular statement about an event, like a bombing, for instance, or immigration, refugee crisis, all of these kind of things, and they usually apply an aesthetic to it, to which the newspapers or other media attach similar to, and then it propagates into the mind of the general intellect such that immigration becomes synonymous with, say, for instance, immigration in the US is synonymous with Mexican or brown people looking quite poor. The aesthetic is that they are not fitting into the in-group of the US inherently, and the only pictures that are shown are things that fit to that aesthetic. And so there is a permeation in our culture already of aesthetics being synonymous with certain truths or distruths. And so they have a firm that is set up to particularly investigate very specific aesthetic qualities of a certain scene. And so we do kind of get the same Sherlock Holmesian detective looking at a crime scene and rebuilding it, But the aesthetics are so intricate now because we have access to so much technology, so much more information, that we need to reevaluate with what an aesthetic is. Especially because AI is now looking at specific aesthetic images, and people are tagging specific images with particular qualities. And so as with the common misconception of AI being impartial, being a perfect system that is removed from humanity, it becomes untrue. And that is because humans are telling the AI and programming it to recognize what are good qualities, what are bad qualities, and essentially they just reproduce the same biases that a human would have, except that it's on a greater scale with AI, and given the sort of subterfuge in the fact that AI must be impartial because it is only looking for X thing, except it only knows X thing because we've told it what it looks like. So the aesthetic properties are very important. Critical AI scholar Kate Crawford on the ImageNet Roulette project to illustrate the ways in which images are labeled and assigned meaning in a database used by many AI systems, often reproducing the biases and racist attitudes of some of those doing the tagging. Low-paid and often disenchanted crowdsourced workers, images thus produce while being labeled with categories such as rage, deviance, radical, or risk in ways that were culturally and often racially inflected. The collective and diffuse mode of truth production is made necessary by a political situation in which conflicts are waged not only over resources, but over interpretation of the real, and identities are formed around the formation and interpretation of facts. There is some talk about how police are internally dealing with situations that should take more time to deal with. For instance, the shooting of Black people. When they see that a person is Black, they intuitively react. And that is because of the aesthetic properties that society has attached to skin color, for instance. These shootings are defended under the split-second argument, where an officer claims the suspect's right to life is suspended because an imminent threat is perceived in the heat of the moment. This defense relies on the notion of natural instinct, but this instinct is culturally and politically produced and can be traced to a long history of the structural violence of colonization, segregation, and domination that dehumanized and colonized and enslaved and turns them into legitimate prey. Couple this with the idea of how we can process aesthetics. One example of how they could process a scene is dust. Dust is an environment. The thickness of our air, its material contents are dry human tissue, biological and mineral substances, and of course architectural residue and building matter. If we look at it close enough, we could see in it sedimented historical layers. And there's even some talk about how we process photos in the age of Facebook, in the age of Twitter, in the age of people can mass produce an aesthetic quality of a situation that is happening, which often happens now because people are always on their phones and taking video. So if an event occurs, it no longer sort of has the same 2D quality. It has a 3D quality because if you look close enough and you have access to all these people's data, you can actually recreate a three-dimensional image of the scene using that data. And so you can further analyze an aesthetic quality. As we use it today doesn't really capture that, but it needs to be updated to reflect it. We now experience the post-photographic condition, which in theorist Katerina Sui's account, there is a shift in which there is less value to be extracted from individual images than from the relations between them. The compound of relations between images is sifted and arranged as a new foundational condition for visual culture. This is to say, even photographs have become images in the hyper-aesthetic sense, sensing each other and trying to make sense of the interaction with multitudes of others. And then they also talk about how chaotic the system is and how that is potentially actually good. So when you're doing an investigation and when you're looking at aesthetics, the more chaotic a situation is, probably we describe it as more difficult to extract information from it. But in a sense, chaotic can just mean a lot of information that can be processed. And now that we have the tools to process it, it's not so much chaotic as it becomes, again, just an aesthetic that we can sift through. Bringing a system to the chaotic situation of hyper-aesthetics is also one of the strategies of investigative aesthetics. We need not always make sense. Unpredictability, chaos, and disorder can be useful or necessary. An unpredictable release of information, such as a leak of petabytes of information derived illicitly from classified state archives, can end up flooding the system, generating hyper-aesthetical chaos. And then, because of the way that we've situated aesthetics at the moment, their argument is that it currently is in the service of the state because they can provide so much disinformation, a counter-narrative, or an official narrative in this case, which is counter to the truth. And people say, watch Fox, and they believe that. They see it on TV and they believe it. It looks to the human eye, or the Western eye, the Eurocentric eye, to be true because it has the aesthetic qualities of truth that they've become internalized with, basically. They see the people providing the images know what white people think is good and bad, and they collectively arrange the images or the aesthetic to look like that. They call this generally aesthetic power. The interwoven manifestation of aesthetic power has a place in the genealogy of state power. If the distinction between the sovereign power of the 17th and 18th centuries and the disciplinary power of the 19th and 20th holds, then perhaps the current form of government of people and things might be referred to as aesthetic power. What is really compelling about this book is that it draws a lot of different arguments. In a way, it's basically just a thesis with a ton of grounded information on the current usage of aesthetics, how it is tied to, again, state power and the mainstream culture, and how to reclaim that, and then also the various situations in which it might be used. Investigation in this, I would say, is less conclusive. It's more about, it's not a total reframing as aesthetics could be considered, but more of a common usage term of investigation being the reclamation of it being counter investigation, as I mentioned. So it's, it's sort of synonymous with what we think of investigation already, kind of. We think of investigation as probing for the truth already, I would argue. And so they pretty much hit that on the head quite often in the latter half of the book. There's a lot of different arguments that are presented, but basically if you take away from it that they want to form a counter narrative, then you'll be pretty much set. They have one really interesting take that I feel is pretty synonymous with what I believe about investigation as well, though. Earlier, we spoke about direct action as a form of research and learning. To work in this way means to try to make the most immediate but patient and careful contact with reality possible, and to change it and ourselves in so doing. Direct action, as its most profound, works to recognize the difficult intermeshing of events in understanding. It aims at being immediate and to have effects by recognizing and working with mediation. So what I like about that is it reframes direct action from sort of the punk aspects of it, where it was probably popularized, or at least became synonymous with the general intellect as that age group aged up and commonly used it and referred to it anyway, to being people being able to sort of lived those ideals in the sense of not attacking with violence, but with reframing what is known to be true, but what is actually true. And so direct action can mean way more things than we thought than in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. As soon as the computer age got to where we are now, there's so much other kinds of direct action that we can still consider investigative work. And I think that was a really interesting observation that they made. In this context, an affirmative understanding of an aesthetic commons follows through as a political understanding of hyperesthetics. If hyperesthetics is a move towards understanding an expanded ecology of sense and sense-making, then the notion of an aesthetic commons articulates crucial aspects of the collective political stakes of this condition. So what they're saying is all of this ties directly into what we would consider ourselves to be as human now. We need to update what our senses are. We don't just use our initial senses anymore. We sense through aesthetics on the computer, on even the navigation of social media, and the tools in which we can use to perceive our environment and sense making, as they always refer to it in this book, have been greatly amplified. And so when we connect with it in multitudes, with many people doing that, we have a lot more direct action momentum than we think we have. And that's why the state is always assembling an aesthetic truth against us, and why we need to produce a counter narrative. And so I thought this book was fantastic. I did give it 4 out of 5 stars because it is not accessible whatsoever for most people, I would say. It has a lot of unnecessarily complicated sentence structure, and it has a lot of diction that is not accessible, and it does not define in the beginning. In that sense, that's what I mean, that it felt like it was written for academia use only, and not the general person, which is a strange thing and kind of the embodiment of academia, if you think about it, being exclusive, yet trying to propagate an idea that it is, so good or so interesting, or, the proper reframe for what we should be thinking, but not accessible to the general public. So really, what are the multitudes that it's referring to? Because it always talks about how everybody is providing all of this information, and many people can do this kind of investigation, yet it is still sort of a hyper-specific skill set that they want to apply to these kinds of workers in this kind of new job. But what is really interesting about aesthetics, and what this has to say about counter-narratives and direct action and the construction of identity around aesthetics, is that you can easily apply a queer lens to this. I don't know how much people generally know about asexuality, but you don't have to be attracted romantically and sexually to somebody. It can be 2 separate things. And so what determines each of these things separately, especially wanting to have sex with a specific aesthetic, but also having a different aesthetic for romance, is really something that you can apply aesthetics to. And in a way, because it is a queer lens, it is inherently a counter narrative to what is mainstream. What we know about asexuality is slowly growing. It's the least known, probably, theory that we have in the umbrella of queer lens. But what we do know is that it is very helpful in deconstructing learned behavior in social aspects. And aesthetics is very key to that. And if you think about it, even genitalia is kind of in that term. People can have romantic feelings or platonic feelings for a specific aesthetic, and they can have sexual ones to a different one. And so thinking of it in terms of constructing your identity in those terms, I think is a lot more productive and a lot easier to maybe articulate to friends, family, and stuff like that. There's a number of books coming out on asexuality, and it's very many facets. And so I wonder if this would be a really easy and good companion piece. So I'm not sure, but if you were able to get through and internalize all of this information and then you applied a queer lens to it, I have a feeling that it would be a really easy vector to consider your own or other people's sexuality, or even just the basic principles of some facets of asexuality. And I find that really interesting. Hopefully I've gotten across at least the main points of the text. There's obviously way more in it. You can see all of the things that I've tabbed. I will definitely have to return to the text to probably make my own notes and to internalize every specific aspect of it. But I found it really rewarding, really interesting, and like I said, 4 stars. If you'd like to have a discussion on it, feel free to put some comments below. Hopefully I've been at least somewhat succinct, and I will speak to you next video. Bye.